In 1998, Fresha Bakery, which was a bread company in Leicester, England, was all about profits. And their employees knew this, because all the time, corners were being cut for the sake of money, even if it was totally dangerous. In May of that year, one of the company's industrial ovens needed a minor repair. One of the cogs inside the oven had come loose and fallen off, and someone just needed to pick it up and put it back on. To picture this oven in your head, think of the scanner you put your luggage through at the airport, the X-ray machine. It's kind of like that. It was this 80-foot long metal tunnel where there was a conveyor belt that ran through it, and you would put dough on one side and it would run through with the conveyor belt through this oven, and then on the other side it would be fully cooked. Whenever repairs were needed inside one of these ovens, the procedure was to completely turn off the oven. So not just the heat, but the whole operation needed to be completely shut down, and then the oven would sit for almost a full 24 hours before a mechanic would go in and make the repair. But the mechanic cost money, and every hour that this bread machine was not operational, the company would lose $1,500. And so the managers of this company thought, you know what, that's too much money to be giving up. If we do the repairs ourselves, that saves us on the cost of the mechanic. And if we can find a way to make the repairs while leaving the oven partially running, that will save us a whole bunch of money too. Someone pointed out that it was possible to turn the heat all the way down in the oven, but allow the conveyor belt to keep rotating through. They just needed to find a way to get in with this conveyor belt moving around them. And so they came up with a plan. Even though the oven sat flush to the ground, there was a side panel that could open up and you could crawl underneath the oven, and right above you would be the conveyor belt. And so they thought, well, hey, if we just remove a couple of sections of the conveyor belt, when that gap in the belt cycles around and is right over someone who is standing underneath it, they can stand up into that gap and kind of be hunched over and walk along inside of the oven, staying in that gap until they come across the cog that's going to be right on the ground. They can pick it up, put it right back on, and keep walking on, staying in the gap until they reach the other side, at which point they could crawl out the exit. The managers were confident, and so they began walking around the factory asking for volunteers, and they were offering extra pay. Two men, 44-year-old Ian Erickson and 47-year-old David Mays, volunteered for the job. And their managers told them they would do it the next day because they needed time to turn the heat off on the oven and let it cool down first. That night, David was out with his friends, and he was talking about how he was kind of nervous about getting inside of a semi-operational industrial oven, but he told them the money was good. The following day at 9 a.m., the oven's heat was turned all the way down, and the plan was it would sit like that all day and cool off all day, and then in the evening, Ian and David would get inside and do the job. But Ian and David had a really important soccer game they wanted to watch that night, and so they asked their manager, would it be possible to go in a little bit earlier? And so the manager walked down to the oven and put his hand inside one of the entrances, and there were fans blowing into it, and it had been off for a couple of hours, and he thought, you know what, this is probably fine, you guys can go now. A few sections of the conveyor belt were removed, Ian was given a radio, and the two men opened the side to the oven, and they crawled in on the far left side of the oven, and they waited for the gap to come around. When it did, they popped up and they began their journey into the center of the oven. About 5 minutes later, Ian came over the radio and said, hey, it's really hot in here. And the manager came back and said, don't worry, it's supposed to be a little warm in there, but it's nothing that can hurt you. And then a couple of seconds later, Ian comes back over the radio and says, no, it's really hot in here. It is unbearably hot in here. And so one of the managers ran over and checked the temperature gauge, which unbelievably no one had done to that point. And the temperature at the center of the oven was reading over 200 degrees Fahrenheit. It was hot enough to boil water in the center of this oven. And unfortunately, there was nowhere for Ian or David to go. The belt could not go in reverse, and the fastest it could move is 17 minutes start to finish, so agonizingly slow. And they could not crawl up or below the conveyor belt in either direction. There wasn't enough clearance, and they'd get sucked up into the machinery. So they literally had to stay in the gap and slowly walk towards the hottest section of the oven. And so for 10 minutes, Ian and David slowly made their way across this oven, screaming out in pain, yelling for help from anyone, someone, but no one could do anything. And even if they hit the emergency stop button on the oven, it wouldn't help them because the heat inside of the oven is not because it's on, it was residual heat. And by turning off the oven, that would just stop the conveyor belt, trapping Ian and David in the hottest part of the oven. Workers ran and got their tools and did everything they could to try to dismantle portions of the oven to try to get down to Ian and David. But by the time they finally pulled off big pieces of the oven, Ian had already made it to the other side and been pulled out, and he was unfortunately deceased. He had been burned alive, and David had collapsed somewhere in the oven and had been crushed by the machinery that went over him. The bakery and their management team were all fined for their part in this tragedy. One day in the summer of 1953, a 30-year-old man named Sam Phillips was cleaning up his recording studio, which was located in a fast-growing city known for their vibrant music scene. Sam had just finished recording a church choir, and now he was getting ready for his next client. And so he was resetting all the equipment and cleaning up. But Sam didn't actually know who his next client would be or when they'd show up. Because Sam's recording studio was pretty unique. Because he was always on the hunt for new talent to sign, he had opened up his studio to anybody who wanted to come in at any time. All they had to do was show up, give him $4, and they could be recorded professionally. This did mean that a lot of times his clients were not very talented, but he felt like it gave him the biggest opportunity to cast the widest net to potentially find his next big star. So that day, Sam finished cleaning up the studio and resetting everything, and then Sam just sat down and waited, hoping that, another client would come through the door. And eventually, another client did. This young kid, he was 18 years old, he came strolling inside, he had a guitar slung over his shoulder. Sam had never seen him before, and right away he could tell the kid was pretty shy. And the guy came up to him and he just said, hey, I work as a truck driver, but I love to sing, I love to play the guitar as a hobby, and I just wanted to come in here and, record a couple of ballads for my mom. And so Sam, again, he took all kinds. He's like, absolutely, give me $4 and we can record these ballads. And so the kid handed over $4 and he went into the booth, and Sam's like, all right, you're on. And Sam basically expected this kid to do what most other clients of his did, which was, they'd begin playing and be sort of like not that good at their instrument, and they'd sing off key, and, Sam just kind of sitting there listening to this terrible music, just waiting for it to end. But with this kid, it was different. Once he began strumming his guitar and singing, it was like he totally broke out of his shell. I mean, he was, at first glance, a very shy, sort of reserved guy, but in the booth, he was electric. He was amazing. And so Sam sat there listening to this kid record his ballads and was just so blown away by how talented he was. And then when it was all done, the kid said thank you. He took his recordings with him and he left. And then once he was gone, Sam just made a point to make a note about this kid that just said, good ballad singer, save. Basically, remember this guy, because I think he's going to be something special. About a year later, in 1954, Sam was back in his recording studio and he was working with another client. It was this band, and they were trying to record some songs. But as they were playing, they decided that they were really lacking another vocalist to round out the sound. And so they asked Sam, like, hey, do you know anybody? Sam's studio manager, who was in the room and overheard the request, immediately chimed in and said, hey, Sam, what about that 18-year-old ballad singer from last year? He was great. Maybe he could be the vocalist. And so Sam was like, yeah, I'll give him a call. So he called this young man, and he was like, yeah, I'll jump in there and record some vocals. That'd be great. So the young kid, the truck driving, beautiful ballad singing kid, came back to the studio. He hopped in the booth with this band, and they began playing together, and they sounded terrible. Now, the young man was still very much a great singer. Like, Sam could clearly hear his voice cutting through all the noise, but it was like the kid and the band had no chemistry. I mean, they just met each other, so it's not that surprising. And the music that the band was trying to play just didn't really line up well with this kid's vocals, and so it just wasn't working. And so Sam clearly could see that. He couldn't really tell if the band or this kid could see that, and so he said, hey guys, for right now, just take a quick break. And so Sam ended the recording, and the band and the kid, they left to go get a drink, and Sam left the booth and went into the control room, which is basically right next door, but does not have a line of sight into the booth. And he was just in there to sort of collect his thoughts and just kind of reset for a second. But then at some point, he hears the sound of music being played back in the booth where he'd just come from. Except the music was different. It was really upbeat, it was fast, it was loud, and Sam could clearly hear the sound of that kid, the truck driver, the amazing ballad singer. He was just going to town, like he was singing at the top of his lungs, and it just really sounded like something was going on in there. And so Sam left the control room, ran into the booth, and he goes in there, and when he got in there, he saw the band and this kid just totally rocking out. It was like they suddenly had amazing chemistry. The kid, the truck driver, the amazing ballad singer is jumping all over the booth. I mean, he's totally into the song. And the band very clearly was sort of following the kid's lead. They were basically playing music to match the kid's energy. And Sam is watching this and listening to this, and he's thinking, I have never heard music sound like this before.
Like, this is a new type of music that I'm witnessing. I mean, it gave him goosebumps. He couldn't believe it. Like, this is a brand new thing. The sound was sort of a cross between blues and rock and roll. It was a little bit too fast for blues and too slow for rock and roll, but it was something really unique. And all Sam could think as he's watching this happen and as he's listening to this is the kid, the truck driver, the ballad singer. He's the star. It's so obvious. Like, this is coming into being because of him. That's the person I've been looking for. That's the star that I've been trying to sign ever since I started this recording studio. And so that very night, Sam and this band helped the kid record his first ever single, which was called That's All Right. And once that song hit the airwaves, that kid did become a star, practically overnight. He catapulted into music fame that few ever achieve. He literally would become one of the most famous musicians to have ever lived. Sam's studio was called Sun Records, and it was located in Memphis, Tennessee. And the young kid, the truck driver who sang amazing ballads, was none other than Elvis Presley.
At around 5 p.m. on August 29th, 1954, a 53-year-old woman named Juliet Exline had just sat down on her couch with a book inside of her home in Los Angeles when she got this weird wave of anxiety that kind of rushed over her. Now, there was nothing she could think of that would cause her to feel this way, and she even looked around her house thinking, maybe there was something weird going on, but there was nothing. And so finally, Juliet, she put her book down and just took a few calming breaths to kind of go back to normal. Like, she didn't know what was going on, but she could tell she was super anxious. Now, generally speaking, Juliet was a very mellow person. She was not prone to anxiety attacks like this, and so that kind of caught her off guard. And the only thing she could think of that was different than normal was her husband, Larry, was on a much needed vacation. And so the last couple of days while he'd been gone had been maybe more lonely in the house. And so maybe that was causing her to feel this weird stress. She didn't know, but she told herself, Larry's vacation was definitely a good thing. Larry was an exterminator, and over the past 2 years, he had not taken a single day off. He was a total workaholic, and so when Larry began to talk about wanting to take a break, Juliet had encouraged him to put in time for some vacation time, put in a request. And Frank had actually done that, and as soon as his boss had approved a 2-week-long vacation, Larry had been so pumped he had called his friend, and they had immediately scheduled a fishing trip, and 4 days before, Frank and his friend had driven off to enjoy his time off. And so as Juliet thought about that, she told herself that, even if she was feeling a little bit anxious about Larry being gone, it really was a good thing for Larry, and it would improve not only his life, but her life as well. This was overall a good thing, and so she just needed to kind of deal with this anxiety that maybe or maybe not was connected to Larry. She didn't know. But for the rest of that evening, Juliet just could not get rid of this kind of baseline low-level nervousness she was feeling. And so at some point, she began getting up and walking around her house and confirming all the windows were shut and locked and the doors were locked. She was drawing curtains, checking in closets, making sure everything was totally safe. And then by 8 p.m., when she still just could not shake this anxiety, she decided she just needed to go to bed and kind of sleep this off. But after falling asleep, Juliet suddenly woke up at 10:15 p.m., drenched in sweat, with the most intense anxiety she had ever felt in her life. And she was totally disoriented. She's looking around her room like, what's going on here? And then she heard a voice. It was Larry's voice. Except he sounded funny. He sounded like quiet, as if maybe he was outside the house trying to come in and he was calling to her. And so kind of in a panic, she jumped out of bed, ran into the hallway, and right in the hallway was Larry. He wasn't outside, he was right there. Except something was wrong with Larry. He was kind of hunched over and grabbing his stomach, and he had his hand on the wall, and he also appeared to be soaking wet. And so Juliet had no idea what was going on, but between all that anxiety and now seeing Larry here in this weird state, she couldn't help herself. She just ran towards him to just make sure he was okay. But as soon as she got about a foot away from him, he held out his hand and said, "No, don't touch me. I have to go back." And what he said was so disorienting that Juliet just stopped and stared at her husband like, what is this? And that's when she made the startling realization that Larry was not soaking wet with water. He was soaking wet with blood, and he was clutching his stomach like something was bleeding in his midsection. And the reason he had sounded so quiet when he had called out to her and woken her up was because he was clearly hurt. And so Juliet has no clue what's going on. Like, her husband was supposed to be 7 hours away on this fishing trip, and so how is he here? It didn't make any sense. And so really not knowing what else to do, Juliet just said, I'm gonna call the doctor. And so she ran past Larry, headed to the kitchen, and she was about to grab the phone on the wall, but before she could grab it, the phone began to ring. And so Juliet just answered it and said, hello, hello. And what she heard was the sound of a sheriff in Ely, Nevada. And he said, excuse me, is this Mrs. Exline, Juliet Exline? And she said, yes, what's going on? What's happened? And the sheriff said, ma'am, I'm sorry to tell you this, but I have some terrible news. Your husband got into a car accident, and unfortunately, he has passed away. And now the second the sheriff said this to Juliet, she just froze and goes, no, that's not possible. He's here with me right now. And Juliet turned around and looked into the hallway where Larry had been standing, and now Larry was gone. Larry really had died in that car accident because Juliet would bury her husband that week. But Juliet maintained that clearly after her husband had died, his spirit had somehow survived the accident, because when she saw her husband standing in the hallway, hunched over and covered in blood, it was at 10:15 p.m. She remembers because when she woke up, she saw the time. It was 10:15. And her husband had died at exactly 10:15 p.m., the exact moment she saw him in the hallway. Juliet would ultimately write an account of what she experienced with her husband. However, from that day forward, she never once saw her husband again. That was the only time.
In 2005, 57-year-old Stephen Slevin was a physically healthy man, but mentally he was struggling. He was depressed and felt like his life didn't have any purpose anymore. And so in August of that year, he decided to just go on a road trip. He didn't know where he was going. He just felt like if I get out on the road and just go driving somewhere, I will feel better. And on this road trip, he eventually began drinking alcohol. And before long, he was swerving along the New Mexico highway, and a police officer saw his erratic driving and pulled him over. Once Stephen failed his sobriety test, the police officer arrested him. Stephen was brought to a local detention center where during his booking process, it was discovered that he had a history of mental illness. And so the officers, following that county's policy, segregated him from the rest of the general population in an effort to protect Stephen from himself. They moved him into a padded cell on the first floor, they removed all of his clothing, and they put him in what's called a suicide smock, which looks like a big blanket wrapped around your upper body. And what it does is it keeps inmates warm and modest, but it also prevents them from balling up their clothes and creating a noose they could hurt themselves with. After a few days in this padded cell, Stephen was moved to another, better cell that had a window, it had a shower, it had a toilet, and he was there for 2 weeks under strict medical observation. But at the end of those 2 weeks, for reasons that are not entirely clear, Stephen, this mentally unstable man, was moved into solitary confinement to await trial for his DWI. Solitary confinement is a type of imprisonment where the inmate is shifted into a single person cell and they are kept there nearly around the clock without any significant interaction with other people or other inmates. The psychological effects of solitary confinement are well documented and terrifying. Just 15 days into solitary can be enough to cause permanent psychological damage. Stephen's first few weeks in solitary were actually okay. He was allowed to write to his family, he was able to detox and reflect on his life. During those first few weeks, it was noted that Stephen was very polite in his very limited interaction with the officers that were dropping food off through the slot in his door. Also, when Stephen had a few minor medical issues, instead of throwing a fit, he just knocked on the inside of his door and waited patiently for someone to acknowledge him, which took a long time, but he never got frustrated or mad. But by January of 2006, so roughly 3 months into his solitary stint, Stephen had not had any updates on when his case was going to go to trial, and Stephen was starting to lose his grip on reality. He was having these severe panic attacks, and he was suffering from intense hallucinations. He desperately wanted to find out how much longer he was going to be kept in the cell, but nobody would tell him. He tried writing his letters to his family, asking for help or asking them to try to get an update on his case, but when he went to literally write the letter, his hand shook so severely from the stress and anxiety that he literally couldn't write these letters. Starting that January, Stephen began spending the bulk of his day in the corner of his cell with his knees tucked up to his chest, rocking back and forth. He was allowed out of his cell a few times a month,
But in April of that year, that stopped, and he almost never left his cell again. And without leaving his cell, Stephen was unable to bathe, and so his skin began developing fungus and began falling off, and his teeth began to rot. Finally, on May 8th, 2007, so 1 year and 8 months of being in solitary confinement, Stephen was transferred out of his cell to a behavioral institute in Las Vegas, Nevada. After bathing and shaving and cutting his hair and receiving proper medical treatment, he was back to his normal self within a couple of days. And while he was there, he had a chance to speak to a lawyer, and the lawyer would say the entire meeting, Stephen was just saying, "Where have I been?" And the lawyer said, you've been in solitary confinement awaiting trial. You've been there for almost 2 years. And to that, Stephen was shocked and literally didn't believe him. He actually couldn't remember that time in his life. It was like it had driven him crazy and he had completely repressed it from his memory. But when the lawyer told him about it, it began to come back into his mind, and he begged the lawyer to not let them send him back to solitary confinement. And his lawyer said, unfortunately, if that's where they're going to keep you, that's where they're going to keep you until you have your trial for this DWI, and unfortunately we have no idea when that trial is going to be. But stay strong, because it's bound to be soon if they've already transferred you to this institute. Stephen stayed at this institute for 2 weeks, and during that time he asked constantly about when his trial was going to happen, but nobody knew. And at the end of those 2 weeks, Stephen was abruptly taken out of his room, put in a van, driven back to New Mexico, and put back into his solitary confinement cell. And immediately Stephen began to deteriorate. And he begged the guards to not put him in the cell, but nobody was listening, and before long, the door had shut and he was all alone again. Within a couple of days, Stephen developed an abscess in one of his teeth, and he tried to get medical attention, but he didn't get it, and so he sat in the corner of his cell, and for 8 hours one day, he rocked back and forth and violently twisted and yanked and pulled on that tooth until he was able to rip it out of his head. Almost 2 months later, on June 22nd, 2007, Stephen's case was finally put before a judge, and the judge dismissed all of the charges. It's believed the judge found out about this horrible mistreatment of Stephen and took pity on him, but we'll never know. 3 days later, Stephen was released from jail and reunited with his family. He had been in solitary confinement for 2 years without so much as a hearing to tell him what was going on. He had essentially been forgotten about. He would go on to sue the county and win $15.5 million in damages. However, at the same time he's winning this case, he was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer and given less than a year to live. It's unclear if he is alive today. In the spring of 2013, a young woman named Melissa finally moved out of her mother's house and got her own place across town. For the first few months she was living there, she never noticed anything strange. But about 3 months into living there, things started to get a little bit weird. It started with a whole bunch of hang-up calls where someone from different numbers would call, she'd answer, and she could hear them breathing, but they weren't saying anything. And then she started getting these huge bouquets of flowers delivered to her front step, but they were delivered from anonymous. Then after that, she started noticing things in her kitchen and her living room were going missing. Things like plates, cups, drink coasters, salt shakers, forks and knives, little things, but since she lived alone and she was the only one moving these things, they really stood out. Melissa had this habit that every time she went to bed, she would unplug her TV. She had this irrational fear if she didn't do that, that it would spark a fire and her house would burn down in the middle of the night. So she was pretty obsessive compulsive about always making sure the TV was unplugged before she went upstairs to bed. And so one night, around the same time she's getting these hang-up calls and there's flowers being sent to her door and things are going missing, she unplugs her TV and she goes up to bed. The next morning she gets up and comes downstairs and the TV's plugged in again. She convinces herself that, well, she must have forgot to unplug the TV. As rare of an event as that is, it has to be what happened. And so that night she unplugs the TV and remembers looking directly at the plug, confirming that yes, I've unplugged the TV. And then she puts it down and looks again at the outlet. It's not plugged in. It's definitely not plugged in. And then she goes upstairs to bed. The next morning when she walks downstairs, she had this sense of dread that when she turned the corner, because her TV was right at the bottom of the stairs, that when she turned the corner, it would be plugged in again and her worst nightmare would come true, that something is happening on my first floor when I'm asleep at night. And as she comes down the stairs and turns the corner, what does she see? The TV is plugged in again. She's horrified but has no idea what to do. It's not some malicious act. And she's telling herself, well, maybe I forgot again. But then she's like, no, I remember last night staring at the plug. I definitely unplugged it. And so she flies around her first floor to make sure, one, everything is locked, but two, no one else is in here. And when she's satisfied that, yup, it's empty down here, and two, everything is locked, She sits there thinking, well, now what do I do? If I call the police and say, someone's plugging in my TV? You know, she can't do anything. And it was at this point that Melissa developed a very real fear of her first floor. And she began going to bed so early at night because she could not be on that floor when it started to get dark. And so imagine living alone, being afraid of going down to your first floor, how scary it would be at night when you're laying in bed, your door's shut, and any noise you hear in the house, you're gonna attribute to your first floor. And so Melissa was living this absolutely wretched life where she's scared of everything outside of her bedroom. And so with that as context, Melissa goes to bed one night super early, probably like 3 o'clock. The sun's not even down yet, but she's upstairs. But eventually it does get dark outside and she still has not fallen asleep. And so she sits up in bed and she turns on the TV. And right away, the channels on the screen start to change. And she's thinking, oh, I must be laying on the remote. But then she remembers the remote's in my hand. And so she's looking at the remote and then she's looking at the TV. She's not touching her remote. And the channels are still cycling. Now, Melissa had what's called a skybox, which means her downstairs TV was connected to her upstairs TV and vice versa. If one was changing the channel, in real time, the other changed the channel. And so as she's looking at her remote and not touching it, and looking at the screen as the channels are changing, it dawns on her that someone downstairs is changing the channels. And so frozen in fear, all she can think to do is turn off her TV because that's the one function that does not have any impact on the other TV. So she turns the TV off. And so in total darkness, in a house she's already terrified of, she is straining her ears to try to hear some sign that this is either someone's down there flipping through channels, or this is nothing, and I just happened to turn the TV on when the skybox was malfunctioning. And as she's sitting there, all she can hear is her own breathing, and she can feel the pounding of her heart in her chest. But she doesn't hear any sounds in her house. She doesn't hear the TV on. She doesn't hear footsteps, doors opening, none of that. It's silence in the house. So after what probably felt like an eternity, she just grabbed a pillow and clutched it in front of her and put her head into the pillow and just laid like that until she eventually fell asleep. The next morning when she gets up, the sun is out and it's this huge relief because suddenly with the sunlight pouring in the windows, it was like the house wasn't scary anymore. And she's telling herself, you know what, that had to have been just some anomaly with the skybox. I bet I go downstairs and the TV's unplugged. And so she goes downstairs and the TV is unplugged. And so that for her kind of confirms that, okay, the paranoia is getting to me. I'm losing my mind a little bit. I gotta tell someone what's going on. And so as it happens, that day she was going to a family birthday party. And so when she gets there, she pulls her older brother aside and says, here's the strange things that are happening in my house with the skybox and all this. And at first, he looked at her like, really? This is what's going on? You're seeing ghosts in your house? But when she really focused on the specific things that were happening, like the plug going back into the wall 2 separate times, and then the skybox thing. So the TV is kind of wrapped up in the weirdness that's been happening in her house and the missing items in her house. And so for the brother, it all kind of added up to, okay, this does seem a little bit weird. And he offered to live with her for a few days and just see it for himself. And as they're talking, their younger brother happens to walk by, overhears the conversation, and says, oh, I'll stay there too. For 4 days, the two brothers lived on the first floor of Melissa's house, and they don't see anything, they don't hear anything, it's completely ordinary. And Melissa at first was reassured, but then started to think, does that mean whoever's been doing this stuff is watching my house really closely and knows that I have, protection at my house right now and they're staying away? Does that mean I'm being watched really closely? And so finally, when her brothers are getting ready to leave after the 4th day, she was practically begging them to stay. She couldn't stand the idea of staying in this house. Her brothers reassured her that she had nothing to worry about, but if she experienced anything weird, anytime, any day, just call or text and they would be there in a heartbeat. Although she did not feel reassured, it was starting to get late, at least by her standards. It was like 3 o'clock, so the sun's getting close to going down, so she needs to go upstairs. So she goes back in her house and does like 20 trips around her house to confirm everything is shut, everything is locked, no one's in the house, everything is safe. And then she goes upstairs to bed. But like most nights, she was so scared of everything outside of her bedroom door that she couldn't sleep. And as she's laying there in utter silence in her room, she hears the unmistakable sound of her back door opening. And she hears footsteps walking through her first floor. And then she hears the TV turn on. And her brothers have been watching her TV last, and they had the volume set really, really high. So as soon as the TV went on, it blared all through the house. And immediately the TV turned back off because whoever turned it on knew that that was going to wake up whoever was in the house. Melissa doesn't know what to do. before, whatever the heck was happening in her house was a little bit subtle. It was like she had to think about what she was hearing to confirm it was actually happening. Now, this person is just strolling into her house in the middle of the night and flipping on the TV and blaring it through the house. And so she immediately is like, oh my God, what do I do? And she picks up her phone and she calls her brother. And he picks up right away and she goes, someone is in the house right now. The brother's like, I will be there in 10 minutes. Do not leave your bedroom. Don't do anything. Stay on the phone with me. So Melissa's shaking out of fear and she gets up as slowly as she can and she walks over to the window to get as far away from the door, which was locked, as she possibly could. And she's glancing out the window, waiting to see her brother pull up as she listens for any sign that this person downstairs has begun walking upstairs. Finally, Melissa sees out of the corner of her eye her brother's car pulls up across the street and he, along with her younger brother, hop out. They run across the street towards her house. They hop over the fence and they run down the alley between her house and her neighbors and they go towards the back out of sight. She's still on the phone with him and she's saying, do you see him? Do you see him? Do you see him? Do you see him? And he says, hold on. He goes to the back of the house where he knows you can look in and basically see the whole first floor. And as soon as he gets to that spot where she's expecting him to give her a report, and he pauses, there's silence on the phone and she goes, what do you see? And he says, okay, yep, there is someone in your living room right now. I'm gonna hang up and call the police and I'm gonna call you right back. Now, Melissa knew what she heard was very real to her, but to have it confirmed by her brother right now took this to a whole nother level of fear. Now she's legitimately fearing for her life. There is a person, an intruder in my house right now, confirmed. They are right downstairs and they've been coming into my house probably for weeks. And so her brother hangs up the phone and begins calling the police. Meanwhile, Melissa is just standing in this room, horrified as she listens to a stranger walk around the first floor of her house. But because she was hearing the footsteps clearly downstairs, she decided she would just walk over to her door and look through the keyhole, which was oversized on her door. And if you look through it and over to the left, you'd actually look downstairs to the first floor. You'd only see a sliver of the first floor. And so very carefully, she walks her way over to the door. And as she kneels down to look through the keyhole, her phone rings. It was in her pocket and it wasn't on silent. It was on loud and it was her brother calling back. And she kind of fumbles for her phone. She drops it on the ground. It's still ringing. And she finally silences it. And then reflexively, she pokes her head back and looks through the keyhole, and standing at the bottom of the stairs looking up at her is a man with a hat pulled over his eyes who's clearly heard the sound, and he begins walking up the stairs. She's falling over backwards, screaming at the top of her lungs to get her brothers inside. She hears them come charging inside. She hears this epic struggle on the stairs, and she hears this person who's in her house, because it was a voice she didn't recognize, screaming, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And then it's quiet. And so she opens that door because she wants to help if she can. And she looks and she sees her brothers have this man pinned on the stairs. He's not moving. And she sees her younger brother is holding something. And he holds it up to her and he just shakes his head. And it's a frickin' knife. And then she puts it together that the stranger in her house was carrying this knife. And before she can even take that information in, the older brother takes the hat off of this guy, and it's their mother's ex-boyfriend from 10 years ago. The same one they all believed had an inappropriate attraction to Melissa. Police show up and take him away, and he quickly admitted to sneaking into her house for months. They don't know how he got in, and he would never tell them, but he admitted that, yep, I was breaking in almost every single night. But he never gave a good reason why. He just started doing it. Police cited mental illness as the likely culprit for why he was doing it, and the family believed this could be something more sinister, but either way, he was given 3 years in jail, and the family, once again, cut all ties with him. On September 29th, 2015, a tropical storm named Joaquin was swirling off in the Atlantic, and forecasters were having a hard time determining how big it was going to be, how fast it was going to be, and where it was going to end up. On shore, 53-year-old Captain Michael Davidson was struggling too. He was supposed to pilot his enormous cargo ship, the El Faro, from where he was in Florida all the way out to Puerto Rico, a 2,600-mile journey that would put he and the rest of his 32-person crew directly in the path of this storm. The year before, Davidson had been passed over for a promotion for a younger, more tech-savvy captain, and so now Davidson felt like he had something to prove. As he looked out over the calm water and the clear sky, he made a fateful decision. Every agency out there was telling him to not set sail until the storm had passed. But with 37 years of experience, Davidson felt differently. he felt like he could outrun this storm. Feeling suddenly motivated and confident, Davidson boarded the El Faro, hopped on the intercom, and informed his crew that they would not be waiting out the storm. Instead, they would be sailing right by it. As El Faro cast off her lines and headed southward, the governors of New Jersey, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Maryland all declared states of emergency. As the sound of El Faro's diesel engine faded over the horizon, cyclone warnings and hurricane warnings went up around the Bahamas. Schools on the islands began closing, flights were grounded, and cruise ships were diverted. Residents of one island were ordered to evacuate, and on another, police forcibly removed every occupant on this island as floodwater rose. But the first few hours of El Faro's journey were totally uneventful. But as they got closer and closer to the storm, the wind picked up and the waves grew dramatically. By nightfall, the ship was rocking so aggressively side to side that it made sleep almost impossible. By the following morning, the rain was so intense, the visibility was basically zero, and the waves were now so massive that none of the crew dared go out on the deck in fear of being swept overboard. The ship's navigator told Captain Davidson that he thought this storm was a lot worse than they were expecting, and that they should really consider turning around before it was too late. Davidson and the navigator were not the only ones up on the bridge, which is where the ship is actually steered from. There was also a black box that was anchored up on the wall behind them that recorded all of the conversations that happened up there. And the black box would record increasingly anxious conversations between the crew and Davidson as they voiced their concerns about the storm. But Davidson was totally unfazed. He was adamant that the storm was not going to get any worse than what they were seeing right then and there. And even if it did get worse, they were never going to be actually in the storm's eye, and so they weren't in any real danger. But to reassure his crew, he ordered his navigator to make a slight right so everybody on board saw they were taking a wider berth around the storm. One of the crew members, a 34-year-old woman named Danielle Randolph, was not reassured by this slight right. She was a hard worker from a military family and always followed orders, but she just could not understand why Davidson was not taking the storm seriously. And so that evening, after the sun had set, Danielle very carefully stumbled her way up the stairs to the navigational bridge because the ship is still rocking violently side to side. And when she got up there, she thought she would just check the weather for herself. The black box anchored to the wall recorded her discovery. The El Faro was not going to sidestep the storm. It was sailing directly into it. You can hear the fear and surprise as Danielle turns to Davidson and says, "We're sailing right through the eye." There was a silence on the recording as Davidson must have looked down at the computer screen that Danielle had pulled up to show him the storm and their course that was going right into it. And Davidson, after he realized his mistake, has this very eerily calm tone where he says to the navigator, "Okay, I need you to make another slight right." And he assured everybody on the bridge that that would be enough, that that would fix this mistake. But Danielle was not buying it. And so as professionally and respectfully as she could, she says to her captain, "This is a really bad idea. We really need to turn around right now. It's getting to the point where it's going to be too late and we won't be able to turn around." But Davidson wasn't having it. And so he told Danielle and the navigator and the other people on the bridge that they were not in danger, that everything's just fine. This is just like the storms he had been through when he used to work in Alaska, and they would get through this one too. Davidson was so confident in his decision making that he told them he was going to go take a nap downstairs, and if they really needed him, if something serious happened, go and get him. And with that, he left the bridge and went down to his room. As the minutes of the night ticked by, Danielle stayed up in the bridge and she braced herself against a steel girder and looked out the window at the rain that was just slashing across the window and the waves that were the size of 3-story houses crashing in on either side of them. And then by the morning, when the sun came up, the sky just stayed totally black because they were right outside the eye of the storm. Suddenly, under their feet, Danielle and the navigator and the other people up on the bridge heard this awful clanging metal sound as the constant rocking of the ship had finally loosened up the straps holding down these massive metal containers down in the cargo hold, and they were now loose, smashing into the inside of the ship. And then they heard an even worse sound, and the black box recorded it too. And that was the shrill of an alarm that meant El Faro was taking on water. Danielle left the window and ran around to the radar screen to see if there was any ships in the area that might be able to help them. But when she looked, there was no blips on the screen. All the other ships had diverted to avoid this storm. El Faro was totally alone. At the sound of the alarm, Davidson came running back up to the bridge, and you hear him on the black box, and he sounds like someone who's acting calm, but there's a tightness in his voice, that he's trying to conceal the fact that he's actually probably quite scared. Because at this point, the reality was, the El Faro was now too close to the eye of the storm, and they would be unable to escape its grasp. They were going to get pulled into the eye of this hurricane. Furious with her captain, she brushed past him without saying anything, and then very carefully made her way down the stairs to her room. And the whole time she was walking, she would have been barely able to stand, because now with those loose shipping containers down in the cargo hold, the ship would rock even farther to each side, because as soon as it tilted one way, the containers would slam into the wall, driving it even farther into the water. When she finally staggered her way down and got to her door, she would have opened it up and her whole room would have been trashed. Everything that wasn't anchored down had been tossed all over the room, all of her clothes, any furniture would have been dumped all over the room. But she didn't care about any of her stuff on the ground. She only wanted her laptop. She found it, it was on the ground, she picked it up, she put it on her desk that was bolted down, and very carefully she opened it up and she opened her email. As the alarms are shrieking in the background and she can hear the sound of the shipping containers smashing into the inside of the cargo hold, she writes this note to her mother where she tells her the winds are really bad and it looks like they're sailing right for the center of this storm. And she's about to hit send when she stops for a second, she looks at her computer screen and she adds one more line. Love to everyone. Danielle never said things like this. She was always strictly business. And so for her to put that line was an acknowledgement that this might be the last time she ever talks to her family. Shortly after Danielle hit send on that email, the ship listed hard to one side and then it stayed there. The loose containers down in the cargo hold had finally shifted the ship's center of gravity. Water immediately began pouring into the lower sections of El Faro. Danielle knew it was only a matter of time before the water reached her, and so she leapt out of her room and ran down the hall, which was now sideways. She got to the stairwell and climbed her way up to the bridge. As soon as she got up there, all the people on the bridge were holding onto the center console so they didn't fall up against the wall, and she heard Davidson ordering the navigator to turn the ship into the wind. It was a last-ditch Hail Mary effort where Davidson believed the wind was so strong it would blow the ship back upright. If this didn't work, the ship was going to sink. And so the navigator began desperately turning the wheel, the lights inside of the bridge began to flicker, and the engines growled and vibrated as it churned, trying desperately to get up and over this enormous wave. But as they were just about to crest the top, the engines completely died and it went silent in the bridge. And so now that El Faro is without power, it's just sitting idle in the middle of the storm and it's getting smashed by these 3-story high waves, and it begins to force the nose of this giant ship to go under and stay under. Davidson breaks the silence by hitting the emergency beacon that notifies the Coast Guard, and then he screams to everybody on the bridge to go downstairs and wake everyone up. We have to get off the ship. On the black box, a new sound is heard, the abandoned ship alarm. At this point, the black box faintly picks up Davidson screaming from somewhere outside of the bridge for people to get in the rafts, get off the boat, get in the water. By this point, the back of the El Faro would have been off the water and the nose would have been almost pointed straight down. And so Davidson is heard coming back up into the bridge, but at this point, the bridge is sideways. It's looking straight down at the water. And it's clear there is another crew member that is stuck inside of the bridge, and he's yelling out to Davidson, Cap, you gotta help me. And Davidson is trying to find him, and he's yelling for him to come to him. And the man tells him he's stuck, he can't go anywhere, he's a goner. And Davidson, with the final words uttered on this black box, would yell to this man, I'm not leaving you, it's time to come this way. And then the black box would cut out because the black box was now underwater. For 3 days, searchers could not even get close to the El Faro wreckage because of the storm. But when they did finally get there, all they could find were 3 life rings, 2 life rafts, and the starboard lifeboat that had been crushed on both sides. A Coast Guard helicopter found a body floating around some of this wreckage, but when they went down to retrieve it, it slipped under the water. 5 days after El Faro's last frantic plea for help, the Coast Guard declared the ship had sunk and everyone on board had died.
At 4 p.m. on Saturday, October 26, 2019, a 56-year-old woman named Pamela Krymeyer was hanging out in her son's backyard in Knoxville, Iowa. She was there with her son and his wife, who was expecting a child, along with some other relatives. And they were there that day in the backyard to have a gender reveal party. And Pamela could not have been more excited. So during the week, Pamela worked full-time as an assistant at a U.S. Army base nearby. But to her, that was just a job. That was not like her identity. Where Pamela really put all her energy was her family. I mean, she really identified not as somebody who worked at that army base, but rather as a mom and a wife and a grandmother. And she was so excited to find out if her new grandchild was going to be a boy or a girl. And so after a little while, Pamela's son finally signaled to the group that it was time to get started. And so Pamela and the other relatives got really excited and they backed up towards the fence on the side of the yard, and Pamela pulled out her phone to film this because she wanted to make sure she saved this moment for future generations. I mean, this was a pivotal moment in her family's history. And so all excited, Pamela's filming, and Pamela's son and his pregnant wife walked towards the middle of the yard where there was this device that was set up that was basically going to reveal whether it was a boy or a girl. Blue for boy and pink for girl. There was going to be some dust kind of shot out into the air. And so Pamela's son turns to the crowd and says, "Okay, you guys ready?" And Pamela's really excited. She gives a thumbs up and she's filming. And then Pamela's son turns away from the crowd and he kind of leans over this device. He does something to it. And then he and his wife backed up along the fence line with the other relatives. And everybody watched and filmed, waiting to see if this device was going to spit out blue or pink. But before anybody could see any color, there was this deafening booming sound. And then for Pamela, everything went black. A split second later, the backyard was absolute chaos as people screamed and called out to call 911. It would turn out the device in the middle of the backyard that was going to be used to reveal whether the baby was a boy or a girl was a homemade device. Basically, it was like the cylinder that Pamela and her son and family had made that basically would fire off either pink or blue powder. Except the tube that the powder sat inside of was metal, and then what they were using to basically shoot the powder out was gunpowder. So they basically packed gunpowder into a metal tube, sealed it off, and then attached a fuse to the gunpowder. And so when Pamela's son went and lit the fuse, as he leaned over and lit the fuse and said, "Okay, we're gonna see what it spits out," he had lit, effectively, a pipe bomb. And then when the fuse ignited the gunpowder, the metal tubing exploded and sent shards of metal up to 400 feet away. And one particular piece of metal shard went right at Pamela and into her head. When first responders showed up in the backyard, they saw a scene that was absolute chaos. Holes in the fence, holes in the house, metal everywhere, and Pamela lying up against the fence on the ground, dead. Amazingly, despite the shrapnel being blasted out all over the neighborhood and in close proximity to other people in the backyard, Pamela was the only fatality. And because it was ultimately ruled an accident, no one faced criminal charges.